So the last time we talked about the Morean response to skepticism. And the idea behind the Morean response to skepticism was that when we try to explain how knowledge is possible and where skeptical arguments go wrong, what we shouldn't be doing is trying to explain it to the skeptic's satisfaction, but rather we should be trying to explain it to our own satisfaction. We should be trying to explain in terms acceptable to us, where do skeptical arguments go wrong. Starting today, we're going to start looking at theories of knowledge which try to do this, which try to explain where do skeptical arguments go wrong in terms that are acceptable to us. And we're going to start with Robert Nozick's tracking theory of knowledge. So what I'm going to do in this lecture, which is again going to be broken into several videos, is for the rest of this video, I'm going to just cover some ground that we looked at again before. So we're going to look quickly again at a skeptical argument, and I'm going to introduce you to the big idea which sort of motivates a lot of the theories that are going to follow. The idea that knowledge has something to do with relevant alternatives. In the second video, I'm going to talk about counterfactuals, because Nozick he's going to state his theory in terms of counterfactuals, so it's going to be very important for us to have an independent grip on them so we can see exactly how the theory works. In the third video, we're really going to get into the meat of it then. We're going to see what Nozick's theory is, we're going to see how it predicts knowledge is possible, and then finally we're going to go back to our skeptical argument and see which premise exactly does it deny. I'm also going to include a bonus video which talks about get-here cases, because this is something Nozick mentions a few times in the reading. We're going to be thinking mostly about skepticism and knowledge, and not thinking too hard about get-here cases. Nevertheless, you're going to see references to it as we go along, and it would be sort of a cardinal sin to do a seminar that involves epistemology and not talk about what get-here cases are. So there's going to be a bonus video at the end that you can look at to just remind yourself, or maybe find out for the first time, what get-here cases are and what they're supposed to show. Okay, so now we're going to do our first thing, which is looking again in detail at a skeptical argument. So remember what the skeptic is trying to do. The skeptic is trying to convince us that we don't know the kind of ordinary things that we take ourselves to know. So we take ourselves to know, for instance, that we have hands. That's one of the things Moore was talking about. That, you might be a student at Texas Tech University. I take myself to know that I'm doing a video recording for the class I'm teaching at Texas Tech University. We take ourselves to know all these different kinds of things. And the skeptic is trying to convince us that actually, as a matter of fact, we don't know these things. And the argument for this is actually really rather simple. So the first premise is that I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat. The second premise is that if I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat, then I don't know that I have hands. And then the final conclusion that comes from this is that if these two things are true, then it follows that I don't know that I have hands. So it's a very simple modus ponens argument. We can see it's a valid argument. And moreover, we can see that even though this argument talks in particular about hands and brains in a vat, we could run the argument for lots of different propositions. In particular, the same kind of argument could be used to argue that you don't know what your name is, that you don't know that you're a student at Texas Tech University, that you don't know you're doing a video recording for Texas Tech University, and so on. It's a very general kind of argument that we can run for any of these kinds of things. And the general strategy is that it starts by saying, well, we don't know some, what we might call heavyweight proposition. This is what Dretske calls it. And use that as a premise to argue that we don't thereby know, that we thereby do not know some, what we will call ordinary propositions. Things like, you have hands, you're a student, and so on. So this is a very general recipe that the skeptic can run again and again, given any particular thing, any particular ordinary proposition you might take yourself to know. So we have this valid argument, it's a simple argument, but nonetheless we should ask ourselves, well, why would you believe the premises of this argument? What is the argument for the premises? The argument for the first premise comes from what you might call skeptical possibilities. So if you think about why you might think or you might disbelieve that you're a brain in a vat, the argument would have to be something like, well, it doesn't seem to me that I am. It seems to me like I'm just a normal human being in a normal environment. I seem to have hands when I look at them. It feels like I have hands when I touch things. So all the evidence seems to suggest that I'm not a brain in a vat. But what the skeptic will then point out is that if you were in a brain in a vat scenario, if you were in one of these skeptical scenarios, your evidence would be exactly the same. So just to flesh out the brain in a vat scenario, they're imagining that even though it appears to you that you're an embodied human being, what's in fact true is that your brain has been scooped out, you've been put in this tank, electrodes have been inserted, and there's a mad scientist at a computer feeding you sensory information. And the idea is that wouldn't you be seen to be having all the same experiences if that were the case, even though things were radically different? Because, of course, if you're a brain in a vat, then it's not true that you're an embodied human being that's a student and so on. In fact, things are radically different from how they seem to be. So the point of a skeptical scenario is that it's one where the things you believe are false, but nevertheless you have exactly the same evidence as you actually have for thinking that they're true. So the skeptic points out that there are these skeptical scenarios, and for this reason, you don't know that you're in one. Because they think, well, to know that you are not a brain in a vat, it would have to be that you would rule out these scenarios where you are a brain in a vat. But these skeptical scenarios are precisely tailored to be ones where you have the same evidence, and so that your evidence doesn't rule them out. So that's the argument for the first premise. What about the second premise, that if you don't know that you're not a brain in a vat, that you don't know that you have hands? The argument for this is that it follows from just a much more general principle, which I've helpfully written on the other side of the board. So this principle is called closure. When it says, if you know P and you know that Q entails P, so you know that P entails Q, then you know Q. So the idea is that once you know something and you can see that it entails something else, then you can use deduction to come to know that further thing on the basis of the knowledge of the first thing. Just quickly to see how this is related to the second premise, it's related to the second premise because they're equivalent, because you can contrapose. So if closure is true, then we can just reformulate it. I'll close it as closure star, as saying, well, if you don't know Q, and if you know P entails Q, then you don't know P. Let's take just a second to think, well, why is closure star true if closure is? Well, think about it. So suppose that if you didn't know Q and you didn't know P entails Q, well, then it would just have to follow. In order for this to be true, it couldn't be true that you know P. Because if it was true that you knew P and you knew P entails Q, but this was false, then closure would be false. So given that closure is true, this principle, closure star, which is just a contraposition, must also be true. And we can see that, going back to our argument, the second premise of the argument is just an instance of this closure star, where the P is that you don't know, the P is that you're not a brain in a vat, and the Q is that you have hands. So the middle premise of our argument follows from this more general principle called closure. But why believe closure? Well, we've already hinted at why you might think this is a good principle. And the idea basically is that closure helps explain how we can use deduction to get more knowledge. So this is something that looks like we can do all the time. For instance, if you know that it's raining and that it's windy out, of course it looks like you can come to know that it's raining out, because you can see, well, the first entails the second, and if I know the first, then I should be able to come to know the second on the basis of just doing some very, very simple reasoning. And this is exactly what closure says. It says, well, if you know something, and you could do this very simple reasoning, if you know that P entails Q, then you could come to know the further thing. So this is a reason to like closure. It's that it explains part of how we use deduction to explain knowledge. I should say this is what we'll call later on single premise closure, because the kind of argument here has just a single premise. We're later on going to be thinking about other forms of closure which use multiple premises. But for now, we can just stick with the simple one, with one premise. So this is one reason to like closure. It explains how we can use these one-step arguments to extend our knowledge. Another, admittedly weaker, but some kind of consideration in favor of closure is that it actually follows from the simple theory of knowledge that we looked at in the videos last week. So I won't show that right now, but if you work through the theory, you will be able to see that this closure principle is actually predicted to be true. So I encourage you to attempt this for yourselves, and then maybe we'll talk about it on Wednesday if we have time. But this is, importantly, the argument for the second premise. It follows from this general principle, and the general principle looks pretty good. So now we've sort of completed our case for the conclusion. We have this argument with two premises. We've shown why you might think the premises are true, and of course we can see the conclusion must follow then. Now remember, we're trying to justify the conclusion that you do in fact know ordinary propositions. We're trying to understand how could it be true that you do in fact understand ordinary propositions. And we can see that this is a valid argument. So that means we're going to have to reject some premise. We have to think at least one of these two things is false. And that's no small task, because as we saw, there are important considerations in favor of each of these two things. Nonetheless, something we noticed in class last week was that it seems like skepticism relies on quite a strong view about what it takes to know something. It puts the bar for knowledge very high. Because this kind of skepticism seems to be committed to the idea that in order to know something, you have to be able to rule out all the possibilities where it's false. Because remember how the argument for one worked. The idea was, well, in order to know that you're not a brain of vat, you would have to, among other things, rule out the skeptical possibilities. And the idea being that you can't do that. But why would you think that you have to rule out the skeptical possibilities in order to know something? Well, the most natural explanation is that the skeptic must think, well, that you just have to rule out all possibilities in order to know something. And this is exactly what a number of the theories we're going to look at denies. They deny this idea that in order to know something, you must rule out all the possibilities where it's false. Rather, they'll say, knowing something is a matter of ruling out the relevant alternatives. You don't have to rule out every possibility where the thing is false. You just have to rule out the relevant ones. And in particular, when it comes to skeptical arguments, the idea is going to be, well, when it comes to knowing whether you have hands or not, of course you have to rule out some possibilities where you don't have hands, but you only rule out the relevant ones. And scenarios where you're a brain in a vat is not a relevant alternative to having hands. So that's how this is going to be the kind of explanation, the kind of response that the theories we're going to look at give to this skeptical argument.